Well, it's a real delight to be with you tonight. I always enjoy getting to be here, and it's a special treat to see several people that I've not seen for a good while. And may the Lord bless us with His presence. I have 3 Bibles tonight because later on there is a text that I want to show you in a couple of different translations. But for now, let's open our Bibles to the book of Exodus, chapter 20. Our text for this evening is begins with verse 8. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. I grew up in a home where it was expected, no questions asked. We were going to go to church on Sunday morning and Sunday night. There would be nothing that would interfere with that, and almost nothing interfered with Wednesday night services as well. I played basketball and football and other sports throughout high school, and my coaches just knew ahead of time, don't schedule things for Wednesday night. Jimmy won't be there. And so they respected that, and if practice started going long, they'd let me go on Wednesday night, but scheduling anything on Sunday was just out of the question. It wasn't until I began preaching myself at age 17 and began reading the sermons of C.H. Spurgeon that I first encountered the idea of Sabbath breaking. The Lord's Day was never called the Sabbath in the home where I grew up. It was just Sunday. And there were, other than going to church, there were really no restrictions. If we wanted to play football in the yard, we did. If we wanted to watch football on TV, we did. If someone asked us out to eat, we went. Restaurants were about the only things that were open in the 1960s. That started changing in the 1970s on Sunday, but some of you who are a little older than I am can probably remember when almost nothing was open on Sundays. I can remember we would take trips, and Mom and Dad would ask, well, do you think gas stations will be open between here and there? Because it wasn't a given that the gas stations were going to be open. Even among non-Christians, there seemed to be a respect for Sunday that bordered on superstition. You know, maybe wouldn't pick up a piece of trash in the yard because they remembered it's Sunday and you're not supposed to work on Sunday. My grandmother was a professing believer, and at the time this story takes place, my grandfather was not. And they had a bunch of hogs that they were going to take to market on Monday, and Mamaw, the professing believer, said to Papaw, let's go ahead and get those hogs in the pen tonight so that in the morning we'll just have to load them on the truck and we'll be ready to go. Papaw, the unbeliever, said it never pays to do work on Sunday. But they went ahead and they got the hogs in the pen, and that night all the hogs got out. And the next day, Papaw says to Mamaw, I told you it never pays to do work on Sunday. And that was a commonly held perspective in the culture, and that was years ago. I think it was Tom Nettles that I heard say that baptism is the most controversial subject in the Bible, and the Sabbath is the second most controversial subject in the Bible. And I'd have to say that in my experience with Christianity in America in the year 2020, the discussion about the Sabbath is virtually a non-discussion. And most Christians that I know, even the very earnest Christians, have not given 20 minutes of earnest thought to the question of is Sunday the Christian Sabbath, and is the Sabbath of perpetual obligation? So we're going to consider that tonight, and we're going to consider, take this sermon this way. The first part of this is that I'm just going to give an exposition of the fourth commandment, especially as some very respected documents in church history explain. So the Westminster Shorter Catechism and the Baptist Catechism, both of which were formulated in the 1600s, have the same interpretation of the fourth commandment. And so let's see under this what is required in the fourth commandment, what is forbidden in the fourth commandment, how is the Sabbath to be sanctified, which day of the 7 has God sanctified to be the holy Sabbath, and what are the reasons annexed to the fourth commandment. And those are exactly 5 questions that appear in the Westminster Shorter Catechism and the Baptist Catechism, which I think they agree absolutely verbatim on their interpretation of the fourth commandment. So we'll take a look at that. And then the question that must be considered is, are the 10 Commandments a summary of God's moral law? So we'll talk a little bit about what is moral law, because I know that many people don't know what moral law is. And in fact, in view of preaching this tonight, I've asked some Christians that I know to be mature Bible reading Christians, what is the moral law? And they couldn't give me a clear answer. So that may be the case with you. You don't need to be embarrassed about that, but it's something that we need to establish before we can think about this question the way that we ought to. Are the 10 Commandments a summary of God's moral law? And then close to that will be, is the Sabbath of perpetual obligation? And so we'll look at that question. And then finally, there will be a conclusion where I'll try to make some recommendations about how I think we ought to proceed in light of what we discover in our study tonight. So first of all, let's get an idea of what this commandment means. And so the Westminster Shorter Catechism, the Baptist Catechism, asks the question, what is required in the fourth commandment? And the answer is, the fourth commandment requires the keeping holy to God such set times as he has established in his word, especially one whole day in 7 to be a holy Sabbath to himself. And so the framers of the Westminster Shorter Catechism and the Baptist Catechism do believe that the 10 Commandments are a summary of God's moral law, and that therefore all of the things that are here are of perpetual obligation. And they held to the idea that everything that God wants us to do is stipulated in the Bible, and the basic moral requirements that God has. If you're going to be a righteous person living for God, then these basic ideas, these 10 basic ideas, will summarize that. And so as they approach each commandment, they'll ask, well, what is required? What is forbidden? So some of the commandments are stated negatively. The fourth commandment is stated positively, remember, but like the sixth commandment is, thou shalt not kill, but they still ask what is required. So we know what's forbidden in the sixth commandment, but what is required? That we employ all lawful endeavors to preserve our own life and the life of others. And so that's the way they treat each one of the commandments, what is forbidden, what is required. So that since this is a positive one, we start off with what is required. And it is that God has appointed in his word certain times that we are to devote to him. And those are the times that we should devote to him, and we shouldn't presume that he wants us to devote other times to him. So many of the people who espoused and were influenced by the Westminster Shorter Catechism would have said, we shouldn't be observing Christmas. Why? Because the Lord doesn't tell us to observe Christmas. or we shouldn't be observing Easter as a separate holiday. Why? Because the Lord doesn't tell us to observe Easter as a special holiday. Now, my perspective on Easter and Christmas is, if it's in the Bible, then it's right to mark it whenever you want to, and there's nothing immoral about doing it on December 25th and whenever Easter falls in the springtime. But I'm just telling you the perspective that many people have held. But what is specified is that one day in 7. And so the principle that is established here is that one day out of 7. It's not necessarily the 7th day of the week, but it's one day out of 7. So all of the Westminster people and the Baptist Catechism people would say the day has changed because the reason for observing the Sabbath has changed. I'll say more about that in just a minute. But first of all, the principle is one whole day in 7 is to be dedicated to God. So that's what's required in the fourth commandment. What is forbidden in the fourth commandment? The fourth commandment forbiddeth profaning the day by idleness or doing that which is in itself sinful. So the rest that is prescribed in the Sabbath, oh, and let me say this, Sabbath does not mean 7th. Sabbath means rest. And so what is prescribed here is a day of rest. Well, the rest is not a rest of inactivity. It is a rest of employment in the things of God. So it forbids forbids using the day any way that you want to. So well, because if you start doing all of those things on Sunday, then it will crowd out the time that you might have spent seeking the Lord. So the emphasis of the Sabbath is not the stuff that you don't do, but the stuff that you do practice, so that you have enough time to devote time to the public and private exercises of God's worship. And so that leads into the third question that I'm answering. So what is required? What is forbidden? Now here's the third question. How is the Sabbath to be sanctified? And the answer, the Sabbath is to be sanctified by now you can find all this online, so I don't think you should try to scribble it down real fast. But the Sabbath is to be sanctified by a holy resting all that day, even from such employments as are lawful on other days, and spending the whole time in the public and private exercises of God, except so much as is to be taken up in works of necessity and mercy. So they allow that if you're a dairy farmer, you got to milk those cows on Sunday. That's a work of necessity. Or if someone gets sick and they need to go to the doctor, or if someone gets sick and you need to go to the pharmacy and pick up medicine, they would say that is a work of mercy. That's something that needs to be done. I suppose that they might even say something like, certainly I would, if the only day that you have to mow your sick neighbor's lawn is on Sunday, then go ahead and do it. That would be an act of mercy that you are showing. If the only day that you have for preparing a meal for your sick neighbor is Sunday, then prepare the meal and take it. That would be an act of necessity or mercy. But if you don't have things like that, then try to spend the whole time in the public and private exercises of God's worship. So go to church, meet with God's people, then spend the in-between time. If you have services on Sunday night, spend the end time talking to your family about things of the Lord, reading good books. It's not that the person who takes the longest nap is keeping the Sabbath most holy. So it's not simply it's not a rest of inactivity. It is a rest where you are employed in enjoying the things of God. It's a rest like the Sabbath rest when God, after creating for 6 days, stopped on the 7th day. It wasn't because he was tired and needed a break, but it was so that he could enjoy the things that he had done. And so that's how the Sabbath is to be sanctified. Now, which day is to be sanctified? And the answer that the Catechism gives is before the resurrection of Christ, the seventh day of the week was the weekly Sabbath. And the first day ever since to continue to the end of the world, which is the Christian Sabbath. And so the Catechism says the day has been changed from Saturday to Sunday because of the resurrection of Christ, and observing that day of rest is going to go on to the end of the world, and this is the Christian Sabbath. And then the final question, which in doing this, I think I'm giving an exposition of what this is. So the final question is, let me see if I can remember it. So it was, what is required? What is forbidden? How is the Sabbath to be sanctified? And then what I just went over. And then the next one is, which day of the seven is the Christian Sabbath? And then the final is, what are the reasons annexed to the fourth commandment? So why is it that God says you are to do this? And the reason annexed to the fourth commandment is God's allowing us 6 days of the week for our own lawful employments, and His challenging a special propriety or ownership in a seventh, and His own example. So He tells us, you've got 6 days to do all this other stuff. You've got 6 days to play basketball. You've got 6 days to work in your garden. This day is a day that if you're not careful, you are going to let the activities of the rest of the week encroach in, and soon you'll just say, well, I don't have any time for public and private exercises of God's worship. I've got too much homework to do, and I have to do that on Sunday. Or Sunday is the best time for my knitting club to meet, or my carving club, or whatever. And if you're not careful, then this day that has been set aside as a day of enjoying God's things will instead be taken up with other things. So that is an exposition of the fourth commandment, especially as it is explained by the Westminster Divines and those who were responsible for framing the Baptist Catechism. Now here's a question, so I'm moving into the second point now. Here's a question that must be settled. Is the Ten Commandments, or are the Ten Commandments, a summary of God's moral law? Are they a summary of God's moral law? So let me first of all take a bit to explain what is moral law. So moral law has to do with enduring principles of right and wrong that exist for all humans in this present age. And by this present age, I mean from the time of Adam's sin to the time of Jesus' return. And then I'm saying that's when a new age is going to begin. And some of these laws will be unnecessary. But so a moral law has to do with enduring principles of right and wrong. And moral law continues for as long as this present age continues. So it is God's way of governing human conduct as long as human society is plagued with sin. And so it applies to the moral law applies to lost people. It applies to saved people. It applies to people of other religions as well as Jews and Christians. Moral laws for all people. And so it may help you to understand what moral law is, to contrast it with a couple of other kinds of law. So there are civil laws that we find in the Bible, and some of these civil laws regard the governing of Israel as a nation. So there were certain laws about how they were to appoint generals. They weren't supposed to have standing generals, but just before they went out to battle, they were supposed to appoint their generals. Well, is that applicable to us? Is that the way we're supposed to run our military? No. That was a civil law. It was appointed to Israel as a nation. There were laws like if a man has married a wife and he's getting ready to go to battle, but he hasn't lived with her for a year. I can't remember the time exactly, but he can go home, let him live with his wife for a while before he goes to battle. That's not an obligation for us. That was a civil law. There were laws about how they were to construct their houses safely. So their roofs were flat. People would go up on the roof. They had to have a little fence around the roof to keep people from falling down. You don't have to have a fence around your roof. You're not disobeying the Bible if you do that. But that's in the Bible. That is a civil law. And then, but you see, the moral law is different than that. The moral law has to do with enduring principles of right and wrong that continue as long as this present age. Then also in the Bible we have ceremonial laws, and these are laws that have to do with the way that God prescribed that he would be worshipped under the Old Covenant. And it would include such things as how the tabernacle was to be constructed, the dimensions, the various regulations regarding the sacrifices, holy days like Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Weeks, and various things like that. None of those are binding upon us because those were ceremonial laws that were specific to the covenant that God made with Israel. And now that covenant has been abolished and a new covenant has been established. So some ceremonial laws under the new covenant would be observing the Lord's Supper, baptism. So those are ceremonial laws, not moral laws. Although you can say if God has required something, it's immoral to disobey him, whatever it is. But considered in themselves, baptism and the Lord's Supper are not moral laws. They are ceremonial laws that are incumbent upon us as New Covenant Christians. So moral law are the Ten Commandments, a summary of God's moral law. Now there are a couple of considerations that would say yes, and then I'll give you a couple of considerations that say no. So one consideration that the Ten Commandments are indeed a summary of God's moral law is that it's virtually without question that 9 of the 10 commandments are. That 9 of the 10 commandments have to do with enduring principles of right and wrong that are relevant for this entire age. Let's just go over the 10 commandments right quick and you'll see what I mean. So, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Right, that's true. There is only one God, and so we're not supposed to have any other gods. God says, do not worship me through graven images. And so that also is true. Most of these that I'm going over are repeated in the New Testament. So in the New Covenant documents, they're repeated. So you're not supposed to worship God through graven images or ways that he has not prescribed. So the first commandment has to do with who we worship. The second commandment has to do with how we worship him, the means by which. The third commandment has to do with the attitude that we bring to worship. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. So don't misuse truths about God. Don't treat God in a flippant, disrespectful way. So that's still in effect. The fourth commandment is the one we're considering, and it's the one that it's the only one that there's controversy about as to whether or not it is part of God's moral law. So the fifth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, repeated in the New Testament. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, and thou shalt not covet. Out of the 10, it's only the fourth commandment that has any controversy to it. So now that's pretty convincing. 9 of the 10 are, no doubt about it, part of God's moral law. And so the argument is, well, if 9 of the 10 are, don't you think the 10th one is as well? So then another consideration that the 10 commandments are God's moral law. Not only are these 9 commandments mentioned in the New Testament, but at least 8 of the 9 commandments are a part of most world religions. Well, now, at least the world religions that are monotheistic. So they will have only one God that they worship. Now, the idea about idols, that is not worldwide. So there are most other religions do worship God through graven images. but they think, well, we should speak about God respectfully. And most world religions have specified times when the God is to be worshipped. In Islam, it's on Friday. In Judaism, it's on Saturday, and with Christianity, it's Sunday. So the three great monotheistic religions all have a specified day that is set aside for worship. But virtually all religions say there are certain seasons, certain festivals that you're to dedicate to God. Virtually all over the world, it is required that you should obey your father and your mother and show them honor. All over the world, it's wrong to commit murder. All over the world, it's wrong to have sex with someone that you're not married to. And there may be cultures where you're allowed to have 10 or 15 wives, but you've still got to be married to them. And so there are standards of the sanctity of life, the sanctity of marriage, the sanctity of property, the importance of truth-telling. So most of the Ten Commandments are echoed in world religions around the world besides Christianity and Judaism. And by the way, I think that is a fairly significant argument to say there must be a God. Otherwise, why would there be such universal agreement about these moral codes? So both of those considerations, the fact that 9 of the 10 are undoubtedly mentioned in the New Testament and taught under the New Covenant. Well, if 9 are, then the 10th one might be as well. And then also the fact that most of these are echoed in world religions throughout history. That's also a pretty good indication. This could be a summary of God's moral law. So those are a couple of arguments in favor. Here are a couple of arguments against. So if you still have your Bibles open to Exodus chapter 20, then take a look with me at verses 1 and 2. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So God identifies himself as, I am the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Here is my law for you. And I think that's fairly significant, that this is stated as a law that is given to a specific people, and that specific people is the Israelites who were brought out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. But that doesn't discredit the fact that the Sabbath could be a perpetual obligation. The fact that this statement of the moral code could be specifically directed to the children of Israel does not necessarily mean that the requirement of observing the Sabbath has been abolished. If my wife were to die, then there would be certain things about our relationship that would go away. But if I married another woman, there would be certain things about my relationship with my wife that would be true of my relationship with my second wife. So it's a new covenant with a new person, but there are some things of the first covenant that are also part of the second covenant. So if I say, as I am saying, that it's possible that the Ten Commandments were delivered specifically to Israel, that still does not necessarily mean that the Sabbath is of no longer perpetual obligation. But I'm examining the question now, are the Ten Commandments, as we find them here, a summary of God's moral law? Now, as far as we know, the Ten Commandments are the only laws that were ever written in stone by the finger of God. With that in mind, I want you to turn in your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Second Corinthians chapter 3. Paul is talking about the honor of being a ministry of the new covenant, and attempting to spend a little time on this and explore how the new covenant excels the old covenant. But let's just look at verse 7. Now if the ministry of death, carved in letters of stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of his glory, which was being brought to an end, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? All right, do you see what the Old Covenant is described as here? The Old Covenant is described as a ministry of death. And it specifically is said carved in letters on stone. That sounds like he is saying the Ten Commandments, as we have them in Exodus chapter 20, were a specific part of God's covenant with Israel. It was a ministry of death, it was carved in stone, and it is brought to an end. You see at the end of verse 13. Was being brought to an end. Or, well, I'm sorry, not at the end of verse 13. It does say it at the end of verse 13, but at the end of verse 7 it says the same thing. That there was a glory, it had a glory when Moses came down from the mountain, his face was glowing. And wow, how glorious that covenant must have been, that the man's face was glowing. But it's a covenant that was being brought to an end. And then verse 8 continues, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? The ministry of the Spirit, that's the new covenant that we're enjoying. For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. And so that which is carved in letters on stone is here described as the ministry of death, a ministry of condemnation, and it was brought to an end. It was part of the old covenant. But there still could be reasons for the Sabbath being of perpetual obligation. But let me tell you, that's a pretty severe blow to the case. If you say that the Ten Commandments are not a summary of God's moral law for all people, they contain nine moral commandments that are for all people. It doesn't necessarily mean that Sabbath is not of perpetual obligation, but it's a fairly serious blow to one of the leading arguments for the perpetuity of the Sabbath. So is the Sabbath, so I've been examining the question, are the Ten Commandments a summary of God's moral law? And all along, as I've said yes and said no, have said, but the Sabbath could still survive without that. So when did the Sabbath come to be? Well, it wasn't in Exodus 20. We'll not turn there, but you could turn back to Exodus chapter 16, and you would find that when the manna came, the people were forbidden to gather the manna on the Sabbath day. So the Ten Commandments haven't been given yet, but there's a Sabbath day already in place. And, of course, we can go back even further than that to see the establishment of one day in seven, the example of God himself, that he rested on the seventh day. Those are very significant considerations, that God respects one day out of seven and rests on the seventh day, and that then would make it a creation ordinance and not dependent upon the Mosaic law, not dependent upon the Ten Commandments for its significance. Then, so those are a couple of Old Testament considerations. Take a look at Isaiah chapter 58, and I want to show you something that will become important as we bring this to a close. I'm not bringing it to a close right now, but as we do, it will become important. So I think that in Isaiah chapter 58, verses 13 and 14, we have one of the most cheerful descriptions of the Sabbath day as it ought to have been observed under the Old Covenant. And if it is a perpetual obligation, then this is also a very cheerful way of looking at how we are to observe the Sabbath today. But I want to point something out to you here. There is a synonym for the Sabbath day that is used here. I'll read it. You see if you pick up on it, and then I'll tell you at the end. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways, or seeking your own pleasure, or talking idly, Then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Well, some very good instruction there, but did you catch the word that is used as a synonym for the Sabbath? The Lord's Day. So, if you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, whose day is it? It's the Lord's day. Call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable. So, it's called the Lord's day. And the instruction that is given here is very cheerful and very pleasant. Don't make this a day that you primarily wake up asking, what do I want to do today? But you wake up saying, what does God want me to do today? Not doing your own pleasure. Instead of saying, oh man, got to spend the whole day in the public and private exercises of God's worship. Call the Sabbath a delight. The prospect of spending the whole day in the public and private exercises of God's worship is very delightful to some of you. And to others it's like, oh man. You know, if you were to say to me, if my wife were to say to me, Jim, your birthday is coming up, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the whole day to go shopping. I don't want to go shopping at Cabela's. You know, I don't want to go anywhere shopping. So I would think, well, that's no pleasure to spend the day shopping. Or similarly, if I were to say to her, I'm going to give you the whole day so you can go hunting. It's like, she has no interest in hunting whatsoever. But if that were switched around and she says, Jim, you've been working so hard. I just want you to have a day when you don't worry about anything at home. You go hunting for the whole week. Enjoy it. I'll take care of everything at home. I think, that is really sweet. That's really nice. And so that's kind of the way it is with the Sabbath day and the Lord's day. I'm getting to my conclusion already, and I didn't mean to, but I'm not going to conclude yet. I just want to say this for the benefit of those little boys and girls who are out there like me saying, when is he ever going to quit? And the minute you hear the word conclusion, you think, okay, here it comes. So and I'm not concluding yet. I'm saying that this is relevant for when I do conclude in a few minutes. So a couple of Old Testament things there, really significant that the Lord's Day could be a perpetual obligation. The Sabbath day could be a perpetual obligation. What about in the New Testament? Are there New Testament references to the Sabbath? Turning your Bibles to Mark chapter 2. This particular story appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but I've chosen to look at it from the Gospel of Mark. And you know that most of the time in the Gospels, when you read about the Sabbath, you can just say Jesus is fixing to get into trouble because there was all this disagreement about what he was allowed to do on the Sabbath. And my eyes are just scanning over chapter 1 and seeing there are already several Sabbath controversies that are identified before we get to chapter 2, verse 23. But let's take a look at 2:23 and following. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him? Now what is Jesus saying there? He's saying that there are certain laws that are lesser laws, and there are certain laws that are greater laws. So laws for the preservation of life are greater than some other laws. I just can't make this say anything else. I've heard other people give explanations of that. I think Jesus is saying he did something that was illegal, but it actually wasn't illegal because there was a higher purpose for his doing it. But then look at the way that he concludes this. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Let's just stop right there. Is Jesus saying here that the Sabbath is a good thing? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Yes, he's saying it's a good thing. He's saying, now you guys have messed it up so that you have made the Sabbath more important than humans, but actually the Sabbath was made for humans. So Jesus is saying it's a good thing, and then he says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Does it make sense that Jesus says, look, the Sabbath is a good thing, therefore I'm going to get rid of it? Instead, if he's saying, look, the Sabbath is a good thing, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, doesn't it make more sense that he is saying, it's going to be part of my kingdom? The Sabbath is a good thing. Devoting one whole day in 7 to worshiping God is a good thing, and it's going to be part of my kingdom. Maybe. Maybe that's what he's saying. It's also possible that he's saying, just like the Sabbath was made for humans, I have complete control over all of it. And so if I say I want them to stand on their heads and ride unicycles on Sunday, they can do it because I am the Lord of the Sabbath. One other passage in the New Testament that I want you to look at is Hebrews chapter 4. This is the passage that I asked to be read as the scripture reading. Hebrews chapter 4. This also is a pretty substantial argument for the perpetuity of the Sabbath. Now, I'm not going to read the whole chapter again, but I am going to point something out to you. Let your eyes go to chapter 3 and verse 11. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Note the word rest there. They shall not enter my rest. From chapter 3, verse 11, through chapter 4, verse 11, the word rest appears 11 times. And 10 of those times, it is a variation of the same word. A word that just means to cease or to stop. And so 10 of those times, it is the same word. The 11th time, which is not the 11th time in sequence, but the one that is an exception, is found in verse 8 and 9. For if Joshua had given them rest, same old word, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest. That's the one that's different. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest, back to the old word, has also rested from his works as God did from his. So 10 of the 11 times it is a variety of the same Greek word. And then in verse 9 we've got, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Now I maintain that the word that's used the other 10 times would have worked perfectly well here if the point is that he's saying that as believers in Jesus, we rest from our own works and we are benefited by the works of Christ. It would have worked perfectly well here. So why does he use a different word? This is the only time that this word is used in the New Testament, and it may be a word that the writer of Hebrews made up for the occasion. But it has the word Sabbath in it. Sabbatismos is the word that he used here. There remains a Sabbath keeping for the people of God. Now, in the book of Hebrews, I'm sure it's occurred to you that the book of Hebrews was written to Hebrews. It was written to people who were Jewish, people who had worshiped God a certain way for centuries, and now the Lord is saying, there's a different way that I want you to worship me. And so there would have been all these questions in the minds of Hebrews. What stays and what goes? Do we have a prophet? Moses has been our prophet for all these centuries. Answer, yes, we do have a prophet. God has spoken to us in these last days by his Son. He is our prophet. What about a high priest? Do we have a high priest? Yes, but he's a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. What about sacrifices? Do we do sacrifices? No longer animal sacrifices. Jesus has taken his own blood into the inner sanctuary, and there he's offered his own blood on our behalf. What about the Sabbath day? Do we keep on keeping the Sabbath? And it's possible that this passage of Scripture is saying there remains a Sabbath keeping for the people of God. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And then the reason that is given for this is very interesting, and this is why I brought two other translations, so I could show you what two other translations say. So the translation that I've been using so far is the English Standard Version, and so if you have it, follow along. If you don't, then listen to what it says in verse 10. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his work as God did from his. Whoever gives the impression that it could be anybody, could be any sinner or somebody else, but whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Now listen to what it says in the King James Version of the Bible of Hebrews 4:10. There remaineth therefore rest to the people of God, that's verse 9, for he that, not whoever, he that is entered into his rest, he also hath ceased from his own works as God did from his. Not whoever, but he that. And now the New American Standard Bible says, verse 9, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for the one who has entered. Not whoever, but the one who has entered. And in the Greek, it is in fact that. It is the one who has entered, which can be translated he who. It's not the word for whoever. So putting the word whoever diverts our mind away from a possible interpretation here, which I'm about to give to you. The possible interpretation is that the he is Jesus. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for he, that is Jesus, the one, that is Jesus, who has entered his rest, has himself also rested from his works as God did from his. Now this makes a lot of sense. If the one entering his rest is Jesus, then it's a rest similar to the rest of God. A rest where he is enjoying the things that he has done. So on the day that Jesus arose from the grave, all of his works of humiliation were done. No more works of humiliation to Jesus to fulfill. And so he enters into his rest. And this is different from the kind of rest that a sinner would enter to. When we rest from our works, we are resting from things that are distractions. We are resting from things that are imperfect. But here it says, he who has entered his rest has ceased from his works just as God did from his. That sounds very much like what Jesus did. And so this is an interpretation that is espoused by the Puritans. Jonathan Edwards would give this interpretation. John Owen also would give this interpretation of this text. I'm just not sure. It seems to me to be, if I set it up and I say the Jews are asking what stays and what goes, then it sounds awfully good. But if I don't set it up that way, it doesn't seem like he's answering the question, what stays and what goes here. It seems to me like the main thrust of this is that we do stop trying to please God by our works and we rest in Jesus Christ. That does seem to me to be the main thrust of the passage. But I'm examining here what is the New Testament case for the perpetuity of the Sabbath. That's a pretty good one. I'm not 100% convinced, but it's a pretty good one. Now, what about New Testament passages that would indicate that the Sabbath is not of perpetual obligation? Well, the first one that I want you to look at is in the book of Romans chapter 14. This one's not all that strong, but significant. Hebrews 14:4. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. And he goes on. So there are two cases here saying we shouldn't pass judgment on one another regarding whether or not people should eat a certain kind of food or whether or not they should observe special days. Now, of course, people who believe in the perpetuity of the Sabbath look at this and say, he's not talking about the Sabbath. The Sabbath is of such a strong, established reputation, nobody's going to think that he's saying you can observe the Sabbath day if you want to, or you can avoid it if you don't want to. Avoid it if you want to. The next passage I'll have you look at is explained away in the same way, but still, take a look at what it says in Colossians chapter 2. You're probably curious, what's my position on this? And I'm going to end up saying something like this. I'm about 65% convinced that Sunday's the Christian Sabbath. And it's things like this that make me not 100%. So it says in Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath." Wow, the word is used. Regard to a Sabbath. And those who say, yeah, but the Sabbath is of perpetual obligation, again use the argument, it is a Sabbath, not the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not in question here. It's these other days that are prescribed to the people of Israel. And what he's saying at this point is, hey, you want to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Go ahead. You want to observe the Feast of Tabernacles? Go ahead. But don't let anybody judge you if you're not going to observe those days. They say he's just talking about these other Sabbaths, not the Sabbath. But it bothers me that he uses the word Sabbath. I mean, it bothers me if I'm looking for 100% confirmation that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath and of perpetual obligation. So those are some New Testament arguments both for and against. Another argument for is there's no doubt about it that Sunday is the Lord's day. And remember back in Isaiah chapter 58, the Lord's day is a synonym for the Sabbath. So in conclusion, and now, little boys and girls, this really is close to the end. In conclusion, what should we do? Well, it says back in Romans chapter 14, let everyone be fully convinced in his own mind. What about someone like me who is 65% convinced? I think that the principles of Isaiah chapter 58 apply to the Sabbath day, whether it was part of Israel's observance or even if it's part of today's observance, and the Lord's day. So call that day, call the Lord's day a delight. And so let that be a question. Am I, it says, let me rephrase those last two partial sentences. In Isaiah chapter 58, it says, don't make this a day for doing your own pleasure. Call the Sabbath day a delight, and the Lord's day, make it your pleasure. I don't have the passage committed to memory. Here's the question that I think that you and I can ask as New Covenant Christians. On the Lord's day, how can I most glorify the Lord? How can I most thoroughly enjoy the Lord on this day? And so, I don't play basketball anymore, but when I did play basketball, I didn't play on Sunday. Why? I've got better things to do on Sunday than play basketball. I have been a hunter for many years, fished for many years. I don't hunt on Sunday. I don't fish on Sunday. Why? I've got better things to do on Sunday. And so call the Sabbath a delight. If you're not familiar, if you don't like the word Sabbath, that's fine. Call the Lord's Day a delight. Ask yourself, how can I best utilize this day, the Lord's Day, to enjoy the Lord and to be a benefit to others so that they also might enjoy the Lord? Let's just say that the Lord's Day is not the Christian Sabbath, and that it is not of perpetual obligation. Let's just say, for the sake of what I'm about to say, that it's not required. Isn't it a great idea that you would set aside one day for the public and private worship of God? Just think of all those books that you want to read. But through the week, you've got to work. You're not like me, full-time minister. I can study the Bible all through the week. You've got jobs you've got to go to. You've got other things you've got to take care of. And there are those books, and you look at those books, and you open them up before you go to sleep, and then, gone to sleep. Not making any progress. But you think, I want to memorize some Scripture. You know how much Scripture you could get memorized if you just devoted 15 minutes every Sunday to memorizing Scripture? Do you know how many books you could get read? Do you know how much of the Bible you could get read if you never read on any other day of the week? Now, I don't recommend that, but I'm just saying, if you never read on any other day of the week, but on Sunday you said, instead of taking a 2-hour nap, I'm going to take a 1-hour nap, and that way I will be awake enough to read the Bible and go to church that night without falling asleep. You say, well, naps are not my thing. What really keeps me awake is taking a jog. Are you seeking the Lord in that? Then take your jog. That's the way I look at it. You know, I don't say just because Dr. Orrick doesn't play basketball, I shouldn't play basketball. You might have a great evangelistic opportunity playing basketball at a downtown court where you play ball with the same guys all the time and eventually get to share a gospel witness. The thing is, are you seeking the Lord? Let that be the thing that you're asking yourself on the Lord's Day. Am I seeking the Lord? And I think that if that is your perspective on the Lord's Day, then an outside observer is going to have a hard time distinguishing whether you are a Sabbatarian or not. So may the Lord give us wisdom as we seek to honor Him in the use of our time.